Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Mindflex. My name is Rabbi Shlomo Buxbaum, coming to you from Silver Spring, Maryland, and very happy to be with you for part 2 of a series that we started last week, The Chanukah Candle Inside of You, How to Illuminate Your Soul During a Spiritual Blackout. And first and foremost, thank you, Project Inspire. Everything that you're doing with the Mindflex, the Shabbat show, the cooking shows, so much Torah, so much inspiration during these unusual times. So thank you for that. And to all of you who are tuning in, who tune in each week, those of you who joined us last week, if you're joining us for the first time this week, to those that we communicated over the course of the week and your feedback from last week's class, we so much appreciate it. And looking forward to delving into our topic a little bit deeper tonight, a little bit more practical tonight, to really show how this special, amazing time of year, Chanukah, wow, it's tomorrow night. And showing how this time has so many messages for us in our struggles, in our growth. So let's get started with a little bit of learning about the Chanukah candle inside of you. We spoke last week how Chanukah comes at the darkest time of the year because it represents a very dark time in history, but a time where there was a transition. In the Chanukah story, around the overall general time of the Chanukah story, the era of prophecy had stopped. And because of that, the Jewish people as a whole had to readjust their style of connecting to God, connecting to Torah. And therefore there was this really explosion or this new wave or this new approach of the oral Torah becoming much more dynamic, but much more focused on our own intellect, our own chidushim, our own novel ideas, our own interpretations and understandings, which might seem to go against this concept of a divine word of God giving us the Torah, and yet the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, is a further revelation of the power of human consciousness, human intellect, to be able to reach deep down and discover almost this built-in, hidden prophetic aspect inside of us that isn't coming from the outside, but's coming from within. And we use that to apply that to the time that we're in now, but our own struggles as well as we go through our own spiritual journey, to say that just because you're no longer feeling that inspiration from the outside doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. It just means that this is an opportunity for you to, instead of looking outwards, to look inwards and rediscover what your own inner light, what your own inner connection is all about, to get creative, to become original, and to be able to discover almost that prophetic aspect that we have that lives inside of us. So what else does Chanukah have to teach us about these highs and lows? What other tools can Chanukah teach us and give us that we can use to help us make this journey through life, make our spiritual search, make our search to discover a dynamic Judaism that we're all looking for, especially during these dark times? What messages and tools can Chanukah give us to bring that out, to connect to that even more? Tonight, we'll focus a little bit more on the Menorah. We'll also learn some lessons from the Dreidel, everyone's favorite toy. And we're going to look at the moon, not literally, but we're going to explore and speak a little bit about the moon and actually find a common thread between those three things, the Menorah, the Dreidel, and the moon, and how this all ties in to Chanukah. So I hope that you're ready to come with me on this journey in the very little amount of time that we have together. Chanukah, perhaps you've noticed, has a very unusual connection to the moon. Number one, I'll show a couple of examples of this. Number one, Chanukah is different than all of the other holidays that we have. Most holidays that we have come right in the middle of the month. the 15th day of the month. We have so many holidays come. And if not, then they come in the beginning of the month. And the reason behind that is that in Judaism, obviously, we're connected. We go after the lunar calendar. We set the cycle of our holidays based upon the moon. And on the 15th day, the moon is at its fullest, which means that since we believe that our holidays are connected to the energy of the mazalot, of the constellations of the lunar system, so therefore whatever we're trying to tap into, the power of that month is strongest on the 15th. In the beginning of the month, perhaps it's leading up to the 15th, but still it's on the way up in terms of the fact that the moon is becoming brighter as the month goes on, and therefore the power of that month, the energy of that month, the mazel of that month is getting stronger. Chanukah, on the other hand, is at the tail end of the month. So pretty much when Chanukah begins, the 25th, the moon is really almost down to nothing. And through the 8 days, really once Chanukah ends, which is already in the beginning of the next month of Teves, kind of right after Chanukah ends, that's when we can begin blessing the new moon, right, or saying the blessing on the new moon of the next month, but within the actual time of Chanukah, the moon is almost not there. It's almost not present, which is unusual for a Jewish holiday. So that's one thing to point out about something unusual about Chanukah. But the connections between Chanukah and the moon go somewhat deeper. Our sages teach us, and every word of our sages is meant to teach us profound lessons. Nothing can ever be taken on surface level. And our sages teach us that of all of the different mitzvot that the Greeks tried to ban, they had their eyes targeting 3 mitzvot. Shabbat, Shabbos, circumcision, bris milah, and then the third one was the sanctification of the new moon, Kiddush HaChodesh. We know that in temple times, they wouldn't have a set calendar, but the new month would be established by witnesses seeing the birth of the new moon and going to Beis Din the court and sanctifying the new moon. And whereas Beis Din would say Mikudash, we're now sanctifying, this is a new month. And Kiddush HaChodesh was the third on this list that our sages teach us that the Greeks had a bone to pick with. Now, if you're listening to this, Shabbat is obviously a hallmark of what it means to be a Jew. We are deeply interconnected with Shabbat. It very much paints a picture of our Jewish connection. Brit Milah is one of the most personal. It's literally the stamp of God on us. We know that Greece really, they looked up to the human body, and I'll be here to say that the human body needed perfection was something that was appalling to them. So to see that Shabbat and Brit Milah, Shabbos, circumcision, these things that the Greeks had a problem with, that is very much intuitive. We can see that, we can understand that. Kiddush HaChodesh, sanctifying of the new moon, not as much. We can't, it's much harder to see why of all of the different mitzvot, ban having bagels and lox, ban having, so many different things you could think about kosher, right? And again, not to say that the Greeks were okay with all of this stuff. Maybe they like bagels and lox. I don't know. But the target for our sages to teach us that they targeted Kiddush HaChodesh. I mean, come on. Do they really? Is that really such an offense to them? Do they have something against the moon? So why specifically that? And that's something that's discussed in our sages. Another interesting connection. Our sages teach us something else. We know the great teacher of the Jewish people that was Moshe Rabbeinu, the only Torah personality who has this term of Rabbeinu, right? Our teacher brought down all of Torah and gave it to the Jewish people. And our sages say that there were 3 different mitzvot where Moshe had to be shown in a vision. He needed the visuals. He couldn't picture it on his own, according to our sages, the way our sages say it. He needed God to show him in a visual, visual demonstration of the mitzvah. 3 of them. One was this mitzvah that we just mentioned of sanctifying the new moon and exactly what the moon should look like at that time that it should be sanctified. Okay, so we have the moon, but listen to the second thing. When it came to the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, Moshe was able to comprehend all of the details except for the menorah, where it says that when God told him that the menorah needs to be made out of one block, and Rashi, quoting our sages, says, Moshe said, I need a visual. God has to show him a visual of how that looked. The third one, Machzis HaShekel, the giving of the shekel for the counting, we're not going to get into tonight because it's not our subject. It also links into what we're going to say, but again, our time is limited, so we'll focus just on this connection that we see over here. Once again, the moon and the menorah. These seem to be two things that Moshe is not comprehending. So we have an this unusual connection where Chanukah is coming at a time of the month where the moon is almost disappeared. We have the Greeks seem to be bothered by the sanctifying of the moon. And we have Moshe, who doesn't seem to be able to visualize this mitzvah of sanctifying the new moon, and also, not coincidentally, seems to have a problem visualizing the menorah. What are our sages trying to teach us? Not to be too creative, but I would like to make a little bit of an observation over here. And again, I didn't see this anywhere, but perhaps you'll agree. If not, disregard the next 60 seconds. But I'm a big fan of the Dreidel. We have a lot of board games in our home, but nothing is as much fun as a good game of Dreidel. Now you spin the Dreidel, and really what's going on when you spin the Dreidel is you get you can't see it on my table, but I'm spinning now. It was not a great spin. I got a none, by the way, just in case you were wondering. You give it a spin, and what happens? So the Dreidel is spinning, hence it's called a Dreidel or a sivivon, which means to dreid, right? To be spinning, going in circles. But then you also have, unless you're a really good spinner, you can keep it in place, but usually you have the Dreidel itself is kind of going around, but also spinning. Now, I think that you see where I'm going over here, but if you ever take a look, interestingly enough, at the moon, and again, maybe I'm crazy, feel free, send me a message afterwards, say, Buxbaum, you're crazy. But to me, it seems that the Dreidel is doing kind of the same orbit that we perceive when we see how the moon itself does its own little jig, its own little spin, while simultaneously doing its siviva, which is why we have different dynamics of light, right? Because we're always seeing that same angle of the moon, but we're seeing it at different ways because it's spinning and also going in a cycle around. And to me, I see perhaps, again, it's showing now how Chanukah is connected to the moon, that maybe the Dreidel is also somewhat connected. And let's see if we could put all of these pieces together. We know, our sages teach us, that the reason that our calendar goes by the lunar calendar is because in many ways we identify with the moon. We see the moon, we see ourselves reflected. It sounds kind of like a pun over there because the whole idea of the moon is that it reflects the light of the sun, but yet we see ourselves reflected in the cycle of the moon. We see this with the Jewish people as a whole as being a nation that waxes and wanes. A nation that seems to be getting smaller, that seems to be on the brink of elimination through our persecution, through the fact that we're being exiled, that we're being trampled upon, and yet somehow we make a comeback. Somehow, right, where everything, it seems like it's over, and boom, we're back again. We're back again. Just like the moon, that same cycle. And based on that, we understand that all of spirituality works like that as well. As individuals, we wax and we wane. Sometimes we feel positive. Sometimes we're getting stronger and stronger, as we spoke about in our last class. And then sometimes we're getting weaker. And the name of the game, the name of being successful in this journey of trying to become spiritual, is learning how to ride those waves, learning how to balance when we feel like we're about to tip, learning how to find that inner spark. That is who we are as a people. It represents our nation's history, but it represents our cycle through life. So we look at the moon, we admire the moon, we ask the moon to teach us, we bless it, we make a bracha on the moon, we kaddish, we sanctify the moon, because we see ourselves, we see our journey, we see the moon as symbolic of who we are. And that's why we said as well that the time in history when Chanukah comes was somewhat a time of a blackout, where we had to look inwards and we had to discover ourselves. But it certainly doesn't feel good. And even though we know the Torah, and even though we know that that's the way it works, when we're in it, I'm in it, when you're in it, we know at that moment, when things seem to be blacking out, when we seem to be struggling, when we feel disconnected, when we feel like we're not becoming the individuals that we thought that we would be in any aspect of life, we feel like failures, we feel down, and very often we feel like we want to give up. And then we look at this mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, and the exact moment when the Jewish people would look up at the moon and they would say, Mekudash, Mekudash. They'd say, this is absolute holiness. And when was it? When was it? It was at a moment, at a time of the month when the moon was barely there, when you could barely see it. And this statement of looking out, looking into a black sky, looking into where you can barely see where the moon is only a sliver, and looking up and saying, that moon, that blackness, that darkness, that struggle, that moon that's just struggling to stay alive, that moon that's just struggling to stay connected, that's Mekudesh, Mekudesh. That has so much holiness. It's amazing when God, people say, I discuss this all the time with people who are in a rut, and in my job is having the privilege of doing kiruv, so many people have ruled themselves out. Not for me, I'm not a good Jew, blah, 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 blah. I tell them, think about which Jewish people God decided to build the Jewish people upon. It was the Jewish people that were in Egypt, on the 49th level of impurity that was so low. God said, those are the Jewish people. That's the nation that I want. Mekudesh, Mekudesh. In the darkness of the night, that is what we consider holiness. We can only appreciate that if we realize that the spirituality that we live for is not the spirituality of always trying to reach a destination, always saying, I'm becoming that, I'm this, I'm that. But it's a spiritual journey of saying that no matter where I am right now, today, my struggle today is the most important thing that I can bring to this planet. Because so often our measures of success within our spiritual growth are kind of framed the way we measure our bank account. You're doing well in business and you have more money, or or any external accomplishments. The Greeks were all about accomplishments. Hey, check out my body. I've been to the gym. Yeah, this is what I'm repping today. They're all about their accomplishments in math, in science, in art. But all of that is, hey, I'm a better artist than you. Hey, I came up with this new theory. It was all in the world of Greece. Their accomplishments are measured only by what they can put on paper and say, this is what I accomplished and you didn't. What our sages, what Chazal are teaching us, the reason that the Greeks had such a problem with Kiddush HaChodesh is conceptually this idea that as Jews we could say, don't measure me by anything else. But the struggle that I put in today, where I'm at, what I'm struggling with right now, that is the most important thing. This is not to say, and I know that many people perhaps might be thinking it, and if you're not, then I am, so I'm going to say it, that we shouldn't set goals and try to accomplish. Obviously, the way we push ourselves forward is to try to accomplish, but listen, I'm from a world, and I know we're speaking to a very wide audience, and maybe you are as well. A beautiful world of yeshiva, where So many students finished large tractates, had major accomplishments, wrote svarim, books, gave presentations, and in the desire to push us and to motivate us forward, often also it became about accomplishments. And we forgot that every single day, just the very fact and when I say we, I mean me, I forgot in that world, in that environment, that just the opportunities to sit down for half an hour, for 2 hours, for whatever it is, and say, okay, for this time, God, Hashem, this time, it's just us. This time we have an opportunity to connect. I don't know that I'll ever be finishing massive tractates. I don't know that I'll ever be giving, major presentations, that I'll ever be right. I don't know. But I know that I have an hour now. And often that got lost in the adventure of trying to become something big, something great, not realizing that just the fact that I had that opportunity was greatness. And I think both of those things are so important to keep in mind. And certainly when we're on fire, when things are amazing, absolutely try to reach for those accomplishments, reach for the stars. But during a spiritual blackout, that's not time to reach for the stars. During a spiritual blackout, it's time to look at what we have at that moment and say, I have this right now today, and this is Mikudash. This is holy. That was the struggle between the Greeks and the Jews, between the Greek way, between the westernized way of evaluating, of measuring our accomplishments and the way we do in Torah. I'd like to suggest, because I brought up earlier, this another connection between the moon and between the menorah, and how Moshe needed to be shown a visual presentation of both the menorah and the moon. And somehow Chazal, our sages, are weaving together these two things. They're making us notice that something about both the moon and the menorah was something that wasn't on Moshe's radar. And we know that our sages elsewhere say that looking at Moshe's face was like looking at the sun. Pnei Moshe kipnei Chama. Says that his student Joshua was like the moon, but Moshe was like the sun. What does that mean? We know as we get to know Moshe more and more, and as we see Moshe rise to become the greatest prophet to ever walk the planet, by the time Moshe is standing at the top of Har Sinai of Sinai giving us the Torah, we know that Moshe himself has completely nullified himself to the word of God, that he's purely a mouthpiece of God. He's an extension of God. Moshe is not just a prophet, he's the prophet of all prophets. His prophecy is on such a high level that there is almost no Moshe that is purely God. That's what it means when we say Moshe is like the sun, in the fact that God is shining this light right through him. Well, as we said last week, and we'll just mention this again, we said it earlier, that Chanukah marks the transition in history when prophecy stopped. And when that world of prophecy, that world represented by Moshe, that world of the written Torah, Moshe, who represents Torah Shebuchsav, the written Torah, that era came to an end. And the Jewish people had to rediscover their spirituality, their Torah, not the spirituality of the sun, not the spirituality of prophecy, but the spirituality of the moon, the spirituality that rises and falls, that ebbs and flows, that waxes and wanes, that goes up and goes down. And one that we have to look inward, not outwards. Perhaps, is it possible, my suggestion tonight to you is, maybe what our sages are trying to teach us when they say that Moshe could not perceive this moon was to teach us that our avoda, our service to God, is different since we're no longer in the era of prophecy. We no longer receive spirituality like the sun, like Moshe did. It's an era of rising and falling. It's an era where we have to look at the moon when it's almost not there, when the sky is black, when we feel what's called in many Kabbalistic texts, mochin de katnut, constricted consciousness, as opposed to mochin de gadlut, expanded consciousness. When we're in this place of darkness and be able to say, mikudesh, mikudesh, this too is holy. Moshe Rabbeinu, because he was so great, because he was the prophet of all prophets, that was something that he couldn't possibly experience. It wasn't his avodah, it wasn't his service. So God says, this you won't be able to visualize, but I'm going to show it to you. And the menorah is the very vessel in the temple that represents that. It's going to be the menorah, these lights of the menorah that represent that hidden light, that represents that light in the darkness, that light that you have to look inwards and say, oh, okay, if I can just do one light, just one accomplishment today, then maybe two tomorrow, then maybe three, maybe I could build myself all the way back up. The menorah represents that light, so the menorah is connected to the moon. And both of those, Moshe said, this is not my avodah. This is something that down the line, this kedusha, this holiness, this will be brought into the world by the Jewish people later on in time. Perhaps that is the message of our sages. And why specifically these two things? And then we get to our next mitzvah, the mitzvah of the dreidel. I'm sure that everyone is excited. I keep on picking up my dreidel. I'm sure you're all excited for your dreidel games tomorrow night. The kids are getting excited. I actually even have my Chanukah gelt out over there. We're getting ready. I was thinking maybe in this year of COVID, if someone could have invented like an online dreidel game that people could play dreidel over Zoom, how that would look. I don't know if anyone has something out there. But the dreidel is so deep. Many of you might be familiar with the brilliant letters that are on the dreidel. We know it has a nun, a gimel, you're probably seeing this in reverse, a hey, and a shin. And what this stands for, what we're taught that this stands for, is nes gadol, great miracle, haya sham, happened there. It happened in exile. But our sages teach us that these letters of the dreidel stand for something else as well. The Maharal, the great sage, the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy of Prague, and many others teach that if we look at the human being, we see that the human being is structured of several different domains. We're built with many different realms, many different parts. And as much as we're all one human being, but yet we know there are different parts of us. There's different aspects of our consciousness, of our personality. And in many of the holy texts, the ancient texts, they describe, as psychology speaks about as well, and has discovered as well, again, much later on in history than our ancient texts, that those can be divided into what we would commonly say physical body, heart, mind, and then often you'll see this idea of spirit, which doesn't necessarily work as well with what we're trying to say. But let's explain how the Maharal teaches it and the language that the Maharal uses. The Maharal says that there's a physical body that we have, which is a guf. Guf is the Hebrew word for a physical body. The next level up he describes as being the nefesh. The nefesh is the life force that's inside of us. It's what animates us. It's what gives us life. Not to be confused with the nefesh elokis, the godly soul, which is called the neshama. That is a bigger conversation, but when he's referring to the nefesh, he's talking about the overall construct of the fact that we are animated human beings with the ability to want, to love, to emote, to have emotions, to feel all the different types of emotions and have all sorts of human experiences. Those are all connected to our nefesh, the life force that's inside of us, that upgrades us from just purely animals, which have a much lower level nefesh. They're a guf with a lower nefesh. We're a guf with a much more sophisticated nefesh. Above that is the seichel. Seichel is the intellect / mind. When we think of the intellect, we think sort of about how that computer right here works, our brain and our mind, but we know, especially as discussed so much now today in modern psychology, the idea of being mindful and how the mind itself can really reach up and grasp beyond just the basic mechanics of day-to-day life. All of that is included in the seichel. So we have the guf, the nefesh, and the seichel. But what weaves all of this together? Why are these not three separate different parts, with each one sort of acting in its own way? Because we know that they don't all necessarily want the same thing. The guf wants to eat. The nefesh might want to have emotions, fall in love. The mind wants to understand, it seeks knowledge. But what is it that unites us? So there's a force, there's something that's even greater. Perhaps you would say that this is the eye of our identity, that is the orchestrator of this whole thing that says, come on guys, all right, let's think about the camp counselor, right? Okay, mind, nefesh, body, come together, let's join forces, let's become one. It's the force that unites them. Maharal's language, he calls this force hakol, the all, the general, the whole. Well, you got it already, but if you take a look at the Dreidel, the letters of the Dreidel are Gimel for Guf, Nefesh for life force, Shin or Sin for Seichel, and Hey for Hakol. The 4 domains of our human realm, the 4 human domains, 4 human realms. Those are represented on the 4 sides of the Dreidel. There's many other ideas behind this. So, for example, the numerical value of all these letters together can equal nachash, snake, which is our yetzer hara, our evil inclination. It also has the same numerical value of Mashiach. Mashiach is the Messiah, right? The Messianic times that we pray for. So we see so much in these letters of the Dreidel. The Maharal and others teach that these 4 aspects, these 4 domains correspond to the 4 different exiles. We won't go into exactly why or how, it's not our subject for tonight, but they say that they correspond to the 4 exiles, one of them being Babylon, Bavel, the other being Paras Umadai, Persia, where the Purim story happened, the other being Yavan, our story, Chanukah, and the final one being Rome, which is the exile, which began with the destruction of the Second Temple that we're still in today. But for us, for tonight, let's talk about how they relate to us and our own processing. We know already from the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that says that the world stands on 3 things, on Torah, on Avodah, which is service to God, prayer, and other types of services, and Chesed, that many of the commentaries say that they correspond to those to 3 domains, again, excluding the Hakol, but the 3 separate domains. So whereas Torah is basically a mindful exercise, using my seichel, Avodah, trying to connect to God, to serve God, to pray, is done with my nefesh, my life force, nafshi, chamda, b'tzal yadecha, sama nafshi elokim. I hope that this is relevant to everyone here. If you're not, I'm just rattling off just some verses that speak about the yearning of the life force to get close to God. And then chesed, kindness, is very much about the guf, the physical interpersonal interactions. So we see already that different parts of our spiritual service are connected to different realms that are within us. But putting that aside, on a very personal level, I think that we find that if we look at our relationship to Judaism, every single human being is different. And I think for some people we find that there are certain mitzvot that deeply resonate with us. They're naturally nefesh mitzvot. They touch us emotionally. They awaken us up. I'm connected. This fires me up. I'm sure a lot of you over here who are watching this watched or received some of the meaningful minutes videos that they send out, and they have a wonderful podcast as well. And one of the great questions that they ask their guests, I've listened to several of them, and they're always, so much fun. One of the great questions that they ask their different guests is, what's your mitzvah? It's such a great question to ask all of ourselves. What's your mitzvah? What is the mitzvah that fires you up? Because everyone has their own mitzvah that they say, when I'm doing this, I'm in the zone. This is me. This is my mitzvah. Some don't speak to us as much, but they make sense. We get it. We understand it. And because of that, we do them logically, knowing that this is important. They're more in our seichel. We get it. We get it. We don't necessarily feel it as much, but at least we can grasp it. And some we do with our guf. We do them purely externally. Okay, I'm a Jew. I'm part of the program. I do it. I don't feel it. I can't understand it. I might even have questions on it. But you know what? I'm part of the club. I'm committed. And I go and I do it. And the goal is that really we're thriving for the hakol, right? We want to be able to fully engage every part of ourselves. We want to say that we do it with our bodies, but we feel it and we understand it, right? We want the hakol. We want the whole package. But the reality is, as human beings, that we're different and we operate different. The reality is that different parts are going to speak to us. Furthermore, there are times that things are going to vary. There are times, like we've been saying all along, that we're going to feel just totally nefesh. We're going to feel totally excited. Everything is going well. I'm so excited about my growth right now. This is just working. I'm in my groove. Sometimes it's just seichel. Sometimes, okay, I'm not feeling it, but I get it. I'm making a plan. I'm working it out. I'm figuring it out. And sometimes it's guf. Sometimes we're just doing the motions. It's purely a shell. We're just going, we're doing, and we don't necessarily feel it. But we're doing it. And while that might seem not exciting, while that might seem uninspiring, we know, Mesilas Yesharim, Path of the Just, many other books say that as long as a person, that the one thing that we can always control, we can control what inspires us. We can't always control our seichel, but we can control our guf. We can control our bodies. And if you're in a bad mood, you can still smile. You might not be able to change your mood, but you can smile. Maybe if you smile, it'll change your mood. Maybe if you dance a little bit, you'll become happier. Your body you can always control. So even though we don't necessarily feel that that's exciting, but yet doing things purely with our body alone also has some holiness to it. Based on this now, when we spin the dreidel, we see a whole nother story. The very same way that Chanukah is about the moon, where we look at the moon when there's a blackout and we say, Mekudesh, that's holy. The same way the menorah comes at the darkest time of year and we light it and we say that these small little lights, they're going to light up the night. The same thing is when we spin the dreidel. When we spin it, we know there's going to be certain parts that are going to be face up and there's going to be certain parts that are facing down. Sometimes this is going to be working, but that's not. Sometimes I'm going to be learning well, but prayer is going to be in the tube. Sometimes I'm going to be doing great in my interpersonal connections, but not so all my spirituality. Sometimes marriage is great, but being a parent is hard. Sometimes being a parent is great, but I just can't get on the same page. Sometimes I'm doing great at home, but lousy outside. Right? Whatever it is, sometimes things are going to be looking up, and sometimes things are going to be looking down. And Chanukah is the holiday of being able to celebrate where we are, wherever we are in the struggle. Pushing out this idea that it's not always going to be a call. It's not always going to be big and dramatic, but sometimes it's just going to be, what can I do today to make this happen? You know, This is a new platform for me to be speaking to the Mindflex audience, and I haven't yet figured out exactly who's out there. And I want to share something which I hope you'll forgive me. There's a vague reference over here to a series, a Netflix series, which streamed last year that in the Kiruv world caused us Mekarvim a lot of trouble, a lot of explaining, and again without just being vague about it. And obviously many will know what I'm talking about. But it was a show about a woman who struggled being part of her community because of religion and left her community. And it portrayed the community that she came from in a very, very dark light. And to those who are purely on the outside, who know nothing about that community, were very, very much disturbed. And us in the Kiruv world, in the world of outreach, had the difficult task to try to, on the one hand, portray this community in a positive light, in the beautiful light that it really is, and to show how it wasn't necessarily the greatest portrayal. There was so much that was overplayed and just silly and dark. But on the other hand, to be also somewhat sensitive to the fact that this show did resonate with many people. There was a woman who my wife and I were speaking with who has somewhat of a similar story, not quite that extreme, but somewhat of a similar story. And she told us that there was a scene in this show where this young woman who had left were with her new group of friends, and there was a line where she said, I don't know exactly what it was, but it was something to the extent of, I had to leave my community because my God expected too much of me. And this woman who my wife and I were speaking to, who had somewhat of a similar story, she said that scene, when she heard that line, she burst out crying. And she cried and actually played that scene again and again, because she said that my whole life, that's always the way I felt. I always felt like my God is asking too much of me. My God is asking too much of me. In the Torah, when Abraham, when Avraham is thinking that he's going to sacrifice Isaac, it says that he saw the place from afar. He felt distant. Very often we feel that we're just distant. We feel completely disconnected. And what a tragedy to think that God is asking too much of me and I have to run away because I just can't. Rather than to be able to focus on the beauty of whatever struggle, and to realize that my struggle, even though it seems so embarrassing, it seems so petty, but yet within that struggle, there's such holiness, mikudash. There's holiness that is exploding from that struggle. Sometimes when I feel disconnected and I'm just going with my guf, I'm just going with the external. Akev, the Torah says in the beginning of Parshas Akev, that when it comes ikvus of the Mashiach, the footsteps of Mashiach, this is the way that our sages interpret this. Akev asher shama b'koli, because you listen to my voice, and the language is Akev, which means a heel. Sometimes we're just putting one step in front of the other. But that journey is beautiful. That journey is holy. That journey unlocks the great Kedusha, the great holiness that we're here for. That's the holiness of Chanukah. That's what we're supposed to extract, to take away from Chanukah. That we become the moon, we become the Menorah, we become the Dreidel, and know that whatever we're going through in life, that's the tremendous holiness that we were placed in this world to bring out. I want to wish everyone over here a wonderful, beautiful, illuminating Chanukah, a light that wipes away all of the darkness. And again, I hope that we meet someday in person. I invite everyone to reach out in whatever platforms you're on, and we can find one another. And hopefully we could continue this wonderful journey and greet Mashiach together. Thank you for your time tonight. I wish everyone